just
We're sure
singing the
we are.
praises of Substack, not least because you all are here on Substack. And I'm here with Ilan Goldenberg. And um, some of you, I think, know Ilan or have seen him. We certainly have a lot of contrarian friends in common, and some of you may be coming from his Substack. And Ilan, and your Substack is Dialogue and Dissonance? Is that correct?
Well, yeah, but I've really put my energy, like, since joining J Street into Word on the Street, which
We're on the
is our
street.
J Street
Okay.
Substack. Have myself and Jeremy Benami and others from J Street. For those who don't know J Street, you know, we are the pro-Israel, pro-peace, pro-democracy organization that tries to, have a much more balanced approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in American politics than what we have seen in the past.
And Ilan, one of the reasons I was so appreciative that you could take some time to talk today. So you were, as many of the people watching know, Joe, you were one of Joe Biden's Middle East policy people. You've been in Middle East policy for a very long time. I have heard there's some stuff going on in the Middle East, so you're a little bit busy and in demand right now. And I do feel like, and I would say this even if it weren't true because you're here, but I'm going to say it, and it is true. You're one of those people where I feel like when I talk to you about this stuff, I don't necessarily come away more optimistic. In fact, often I come away a little more pessimistic, but I definitely feel like I come away smarter about what's going on. So I want to dive right in, and everyone who's watching, please ask questions, write those write a message, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. So and I'm going to just assume that we're all somewhat familiar with what's going on in the news, and ask you a couple of questions about where we are in this moment. So let me begin with over the last, almost 3 weeks, it feels like we still have not figured out clearly from the administration why they started this war. Um, if you've sat in some of these war game scenarios, you've been in the Pentagon, you've been in the White House. I understand that you are not necessarily in agreement with this war. In fact, I would say you're not. But what do you think the White House was thinking, or what do you think, to the extent they were, or were they not? Are you able to parse something together?
Yeah. So here's what I think happened. We had the protests in early January, right? Very significant protests. Trump at that moment comes out very loudly and says, Iranian people, go out on the streets. We'll defend you. We'll protect you. Iranian people do go out in the streets in big numbers, believing the U.S. is coming to their defense. And they get slaughtered by this very terrible regime. Then Trump says, okay, we need to respond, turns to his people, turns to the region, and they say, well, we're not really militarily postured to respond in any way. If you start striking now, we're not going to be able to defend ourselves. And so it takes about 6 weeks from that point to actually move all the assets that you need into the Middle East to respond. In the meantime, Trump is making a lot of noise. The moment has passed, unfortunately, in terms of the protesters. But Trump is continuing to talk, continuing to threaten, put himself in a box, move all these forces into the region. You have some negotiation over the nuclear issue, which is not with Witkoff and Kushner, which is not at all where this started. That really goes nowhere. And I think Trump feels boxed in. And then the problem is, once you put all those forces in the region, you can't keep them there forever. So
Right.
he's boxed in. But the other thing that's going on at the same time is he did Venezuela, right? He took out Maduro in a day. It was so easy. Everybody told him how hard it would be. There's a long history. I think a lot of us, including me, warned about the war last June that ended up going much better than people expected, right? And you even go back to the days where he killed Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general, back in 2020. Again, people thought it would lead to a war. It didn't. So it's this combination of putting himself in a box and feeling like the experts don't know what they're talking about. I can do this. It'll be quick and snappy. And that's what.
That's interesting. See, it reminds me in a way of what happened with Putin, where it feels like Putin got away with a lot of things, kept raising the stakes, and then got himself bogged down in Ukraine, thinking, "Oh, this will be easy." Right? I mean, it's the problem, I guess, with people who have that level of arrogance. On the other hand, it is, I suppose, an interesting commentary on the sort of national security infrastructure that we have. It was wrong about something, Venezuela and some other stuff, or maybe just raise the downside risk. Anyway, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I agree. I've actually been having conversations with folks about this. I think it's also the nature of dictators, right? And authoritarians is they're willing to take these risks and they work until they don't. Why somebody
Yeah,
like me is so risk averse is because, look at Putin. He could do 10 brilliant things and he blew it all up with Ukraine, which has been so much more damaging to Russia than everything else. So a
yeah,
guy like me, tends to look more at the downside scenarios and concern for the risks because, sins of commission in this space are often just much more damaging for our interests and much more costly than sins of omission.
yeah. That's interesting. It also makes me think about, frankly, what we're seeing, and you're a foreign policy guy, so we're going to talk mostly about that. But what we've seen domestically, right? We see the Trump administration with cracking down on protesters. They sort of say, "What can we get away with?" And unlike traditionally democratic governments, say we'll stop short of crossing the line. And Trump, I think, sort of says, "Well, how do you know where the line is until you've crossed it and you've made a mess of things?" And that's kind of where we are, except now it's the entire Middle East. So with that, it feels like, and I was reading, and you had an excellent I think it was just a note, so it doesn't even take long to read. But if you haven't read it yet and you're watching, Ilan kind of laid out how this could end up. None of it is very good, but it's very succinct, really helpful. And it seems like a lot of this is creating a situation where we're now stuck, right? All that in retrospect would have been great if none of it had happened, but here we are. So if you were advising a sane and normal president today, given everything that's happened, what can we do to make the best of a bad situation?
So I think at this point, president should basically announce we've achieved our objective. Our objective was to degrade Iran's military capabilities as much as possible. That has been achieved. We are ready to stop. We are also ready to tell Israel to stop and restrain Israel from going again. As long as Iran doesn't continue on its nuclear program and doesn't attack regional partners. So if he were to announce that, do the Iranians stop in response? Maybe. They might not at first. They might like to deliver a few more blows and demonstrate that they won and do their own thing and feel like they need to because they actually feel like they're in the position of power right now. But still, the entire world will jump on that and want that outcome. That'll include, except for maybe Putin, because the Russians are the only ones
Right.
benefiting in all this. But everybody else, including the Chinese, including the Europeans, including the Gulf states, all of Iran's neighbors, will press the Iranians to accept that.
I
And
see.
and I think over time it could end it.
Do you think where are the Israelis in this at this point? You said Putin is sort of winning out of this. Are the Israelis, without doing the whole like Joe Kent conspiracy theory thing,
Yeah.
but Israel's a country, right? Is Israel or is Netanyahu? Does Netanyahu think that this is going well so far?
Yeah, I think he has a different set of interests than the United States. And that, for Israel, what Netanyahu wants, what Israel wants is Iran as degraded as possible, right?
Hmm.
Because so it doesn't threaten Israel. So total collapse and chaos inside of Iran, internally distracted, that's fine. And Iran has a lot less missiles to launch at Israel, that's fine. Care less about global oil prices, regional stability. Trump wants this to end more quickly and in a way that keeps the region stable and keeps oil flowing and keeps the economy functioning, global economy functioning. I think those things matter less than Netanyahu, which is why you see Israel taking more risk in the kind of strikes it's conducting. Uh, you know, um, I do think the Israelis have their own danger. They're now escalating in Lebanon. If they get stuck in a big, ugly war in Lebanon, which is very possible, that's
Right.
more costly for Israel.
So let's also talk for a second about the other set of incentives, which seem to be if you're an Iranian leader at this point, right? Like your odds of surviving personally are not as high as the odds of the regime surviving. That seems like a euphemistic way to put it, right? Um, I don't know when you, for example, and I'm sure some of what you saw and worked on when you were in the Pentagon and other places you can't talk about, but um, these decapitation strikes, as they're called. is there a theory behind that, or is the theory like, wouldn't it be cool if we killed some bad guys?
I mean, I think again for the Israelis, there's a desire to just destabilize as much as possible, right? Weaker, more fragmented means less threat to Israel. I think that's
I
the
see.
relation. And they're doing most of the decapitation strikes, but they're doing them with the approval of the United States. And I should say, you know, it's very important to ultimately put responsibility on all of this as Americans on Donald Trump first, because he had the choice to make the decision about whether to send American troops into harm's way or not. Now, obviously, this is something Netanyahu wanted and has encouraged and is happy with and played a role in. But at the end of the day, like the decision is with the American president. Netanyahu tried to get Obama to do this, tried to get
Right.
Biden to do this. They said no.
Well, and
Um,
presumably he tried to get Trump to do it the first time, right? I mean, he's been banging this drum for a while.
yes, exactly. But at the end of the day, it's Trump's responsibility. I don't know. Going back to your question on decapitation, I don't know what the American theory of the case is for that. I think it might be, you heard Trump on the first day say we accidentally killed a bunch of the other guys we thought might take over. I think he was hoping for a Venezuela scenario, like a
Right.
Gulf Rodriguez option. Somebody else comes up who he can work with, who's more moderate, more reasonable. The problem is that opportunity did exist. Okay. The Iranian system is not universally hardliners. There's a real debate inside the Islamic Republic. You have these more pragmatic, more moderate factions. I think a lot of us thought that when Ali Khamenei was 86 years old and had had prostate cancer multiple times, like the guy was going to die. And when he did, there would be a real debate inside the system. We weren't going to get democracy, but we might have gotten people who were like, well, maybe it's time to try things differently and get more economic benefits and engagement with the world and pull back on some of our really problematic regional behavior and our nuclear program. But by killing Khamenei, martyring him, and forcing the regime to choose its next leader when it was facing an existential threat, pretty much guaranteed the outcome would be more hardline. So you have a guy
Yeah.
who's not 30 years younger, whose whole family was killed in these strikes, and is just the son of the father. The worst outcome.
Yeah. I mean, to me, that feels like the most damning indictment so far is to say, like, whatever the opposite of a regime change is, that seems to be what we have pulled off at this point. Um, Let me ask,
It's
you know,
still it's still possible they end up killing him, and we see
well,
where it all.
so right, so this was part of my question is that I think that as a Democrat, as somebody sort of disinclined to think that Trump is very wise, um, I have trouble imagining a good outcome here, but that's partly, I think, a lack of imagination on my fault, right? We're all, partisanship is real. And I'm not going to try to be objective, but I would love it for you to be. What is a best case scenario, including, as you're saying, is there a case for saying, because I've seen this, people writing about it, basically saying, don't stop now, Mr. President, right? Like we've already got the pain. If you keep going, we'll get some of the gain. Is there a case for that?
Yeah, so it's not necessarily a case I agree with, but I can still paint it for you for sure. The
Yeah.
argument is, you know, we've already we need to finish degrading Iran's capabilities as much as possible. At this point, we've started a war. We got to sink the entire navy. We got to get as many of the missiles out as possible. We got to knock out as much of the nuclear program as possible. Um, in the best case scenario is you do that, and then you get to some kind of an agreement where everybody stops, and then you have Iran as kind of a shell of its former self. And the best case scenario is, 6 or 12 months later, the regime collapses as a result, and you have some kind of more managed, stable transition. It's actually, the comparison you can draw it's to Kosovo, and after the war in Kosovo, Milosevic basically was tossed out of power 6 months later. His government collapsed.
Right.
Uh, so I don't see that as I do not see that as the likely scenario. We can talk about more likely scenarios about how this ends, but that's the best outcome.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of, I don't know if you play Hearts, but it's kind of, I haven't for a long time, but I feel like at summer camp I did. And right, like there's like, you can shoot the moon every so often, right? So sometimes you take all the risk and you get the big reward, but that and it could theoretically work, could also go very poorly. Let me ask you, you mentioned Venezuela, and one of the things that I'm certainly curious about, I bet a lot of people watching are curious about. So I was skeptical that Venezuela was going to be anything but disastrous, and it seems to have turned out pretty well given the circumstances. Certainly better than I would have guessed. And Iran, right, seems to have turned out very differently. Even if it eventually works out, it's not another Venezuela. What's the difference between the two countries, and why do you think that taking a sort of Venezuela approach to Iran so clearly didn't work?
So Venezuela is very close to the United States geographically. It's also smaller, but you could fly forces right into Caracas and grab Maduro out. It also doesn't have the military capability that Iran does. So Iran is halfway around the world. So we had to spend 2 months positioning everything,
Right.
getting ready, 2 months for them to get ready. It's much more militarily capable. It's been building nuclear weapons, or at least giving itself the option to build nuclear weapons, and the possibilities. It's got a robust missile program, drones. It's a real military, right? So I think that's the biggest difference. The other difference is, look, we talked about. I've played a lot of different war games uh, associated with exactly this scenario. The way that war games tend to work is you start low and you move up to test different things. And
Tell me about what that means. What do you mean by starting low? Like, war games sound fun to me, but I've never played one. So describe this for people who maybe don't have that experience.
sure. So it's basically usually 2 or 3 steps. You have different teams. Everybody's playing different actors. You have the Iran team, you have the Israel team, the US team, maybe you have the Russians, Chinese, Gulf. Everybody's playing a different role. And usually you start with a step 1 scenario, which is something relatively limited happens. Like Israel strikes something in Iran. Maybe it's Israel
Right.
strikes Iran's nuclear program. The US is not involved at all. This was oftentimes the game. Uh, then you start from there. How does Iran respond? How does the US de-escalate? And usually what you found, almost similar to what we ended up with last June, something at that lower level, that first step. And in that scenario, you tended to find the Iranians wanted to hit back at Israel, but they were afraid of getting in a war with the United States.
Right.
Now, then you go to step 2 and 3 artificially. Even if what you're finding is things are working out okay, what you do with the game in the next step is you're like, we're going to force it. We're going to make the scenario so that things go much more intense and see
Got
how
it.
it reacts. Right. And so what we see now are step 2 or 3. We're much further along in the game. And what
Right.
we tended to find in those scenarios is once they're put in the corner, the Iranians come out fighting when they have no
Right.
choice. Joe Biden used to actually have a saying, or has a saying, says, "Don't put a man in a corner if his only way out is through you."
Yeah. Well,
And
yeah.
that's what.
It's funny. I think about that because it's if anyone sort of should understand the desperation, it's Donald Trump, right? Like, this is a guy who spent 2020 through 2024 being like, well, I'm trying to keep myself out of prison, and I'll do anything it takes. And it is interesting, right? I feel like again, it's the same lesson that, and I'm not suggesting that Iran and Ukraine are morally equivalent. I think they're not even close to morally equivalent. But sort of or functionally speaking, countries tend to dislike it when you try to topple them. Um, so along those lines, let me ask you about the war games, because this is something you mentioned war games in some of your writing, but I don't think we've ever talked about it. Um, so okay, do you draft? Like, how do you decide who's on what team?
Oh, usually if you're doing it well, you put different experts, right? I mean, I did a bunch of these when I was at a think tank, also CNAS.
Yeah.
And so, I you try to get So you try to get, for example, for the Iran team, I would always kind of try to get experts in domestic Iranian politics, people who really,
Hmm.
and then they play the role of the supreme leader. Sometimes you can do it where you actually have, you're the supreme leader and you're the president and you guys go figure this out. And they really are supposed to get into
Yeah.
and then, for the Israel team, you would make sure you maybe bring in an Israeli if you can. That's what we did in one of the games I set up at CNAS. We couldn't really bring in Iranians from Iran to the United States, but
Right.
and then you would have somebody from the Gulf. We had Saudi people who were representing the Gulf states, and we had a bunch of former American government officials who had worked on these issues at the Pentagon, at the State Department, playing the United States. And
Yeah.
you're really like, you're not going to be able to play the whole thing through. The point of these games is not to actually predict how it's all going to go. Uh, there's a saying, it's similar to military planning. You know, it's not the plan, it's the planning, right?
Yeah.
The process, thinking it through and really considering what you would do in that moment, then helps inform afterwards, when you pull back and as policymakers and say, okay, this is what we know, this is what happened. How
Yeah.
do we prepare for that? How do we avoid that? How do we think through some of the, and it's clear, these war games have been being played in the US government for years. Nobody told Donald Trump about any of them.
Right. Well,
Because
it reminds yeah.
all those
Oh, no, please.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it reminds me of something Eisenhower said, which was, "Planning is priceless, plans are useless." Um,
Mhm.
and I think the other piece of that, I have a bunch of questions about these war games, including, is there a big conference table like in Game of Thrones?
Depends on who's doing
Okay.
it. Fun to have.
In my mind, there's a big Game of Thrones conference table, so we're just gonna take that as a given. Um,
Which one? Like
but
the one they had the one. What is it called? Now I'm blanking on it. At Dragonstone. Is that what one you're thinking of?
yeah, exactly. Well, just something where you can push pieces around a giant map. I feel like if we're gonna go to war, at least someone should get to push some pieces around a giant map. That's
Some
just
of
my
them
own
do have that totally.
personal view.
Yes.
So let me ask, um, when it comes to, so it did seem to me, it does seem to me that Trump has a pretty clear theory of some version of game theory, right? Which is, if I have a lot of leverage over you, then you should capitulate, right? And that seemed to be what he was originally suggesting in Venezuela, right? Which was like, do do what we want or else, and we got the or else, and then he turned around to Iran and said, do what we want or else, and now that we're in the or else, and I can understand at a most basic level saying, well, if somebody's got a gun to your head and they tell you to do something, you'll do it. Why? My question is, is this an ideological thing from the point of view of the Iranians? Is it do they just sort of think there's, if you capitulate now, there's no off ramp ever? It's some combination. What is, how much of this is, Clash of Civilizations obviously is that has not aged well, but a clash of sort of cultures, right? People with different understandings of what rational means.
I think this is less culture and more the fact that the Iranians got their butts kicked last June, and 6 months later, the Israelis and the US are doing it again. And the Iranians are like, if we just stop now, 6 months or a year from now, they'll just be doing it again. So that's part
Right.
of it. They feel like if they stop now, they're in a position of weakness. But two, they've discovered some leverage. I think they always knew it, but they were afraid to test it. It was always a possibility. This concept of interfering with global oil shipping, stopping flow through the Strait of Hormuz, attacking oil and energy infrastructure in the Gulf. Something they didn't dare do because it was so risky, because the consequences
Yeah.
it might bring. But put into the corner, they have done it. And what they are finding is Donald Trump responds to it. He does not like it. He keeps, today the administration is talking about relaxing oil sanctions on Iran so that Iran can sell oil so that global energy markets don't get out of control and oil prices stop rising.
Yeah.
That is insane and a clear demonstration that the Iranians looking at this and they're like, we can keep pushing press. We have the leverage now. I think that's
Right. Well, so let me. It sounds like you didn't play Iran in the war games, right? Because you were not an Iran expert, even though you know a lot about the region. Is that
I
that have it
usually
right?
I usually played the US because I was a
Okay.
teammate.
Yeah,
We
it's boring,
yeah,
but that's all right. Yeah.
yeah,
But let's say for a moment you were Iran, and I know, by the way, that you're, as somebody who knows a lot about the Middle East, your time is in high demand right now. So you just let me know when you got to go. I figured we'll just talk for another couple minutes.
that sounds good.
Um, and I should say, by the way, for everyone who has joined, I am with Ilan Goldenberg, former Biden policy advisor on Middle East issues. Um, and before that was has been in Middle East policy for a very long time, and writes at Word on the Street. On So check out that Substack. Um, and so, Alon, my question for you was: we've talked about what America should do if you were advising an American president. Let's say you were sitting down with the new Ayatollah Khomeini, and you seem to pronounce that much more elegantly than I do, but still. If you were sitting down with the new Ayatollah and saying, okay, here's what our end game looks like, or here's how we come to a conclusion, what would you be advising within the realm of possibility? What should it, what might Iran do here? What might they feel comfortable doing to get out of this conflict?
Right, I'm not gonna do it in exactly in the frame of advice
That's fine.
because
Yeah, I get,
as a long
because you're smart. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, American policymaker, I like it just
That
that doesn't
that
sit
seems
with me.
reasonable. Yeah.
But what I'll tell you, I think they are thinking and what they're debating, right, is, you know, on the one hand, I think if it ended now, they have a way of saving face and declaring victory, and maybe Trump can always find a way to declare victory. So, I think from that perspective, if the US goes first and says it's time for this to be over, I think they can find their way off of it, and I would hope they would. I think there's elements of their system that would say, "No, we have to keep going, we have to deliver a blow." It would be a debate for sure.
Mhm.
Um, I do think the biggest factors that will matter there, will be they're concerned that we're just gonna be at this again in 6 months or a year, and they're gonna want some assurances. They tend to care a lot about the United Nations. I think they overvalue it, frankly,
Mm.
but they will maybe want some kind of UN Security Council resolution that guarantees this isn't Israel and the US aren't gonna attack them again in 6 months. Those are the types of things they might ask for or want. Um, you know, but I also think if we go first and say we're ready for this to be over, even if they're not quite ready for it to be over, they do care about what the rest of the world thinks. And going back to that
Right.
point, they will find themselves squeezed and find a way out. Otherwise, I think they are just as long as this Trump is going, they're just going to do whatever they can. They don't have to win. By not
Right.
losing, they win every day. This is similar to Iraq and Afghanistan, and that if they launch 100 missiles and 90 of them are intercepted, they still win, right?
Yeah.
Because us to win, we either need to topple the regime, because that's what the expectation we've set, or the whole argument we're making is we're doing this to make the region much more secure. The region has to feel more secure. It doesn't feel secure if stuff's going boom in the Strait of Hormuz. So
Right.
they just need to do enough to make it all feel chaotic, drive up oil prices, and that's, kind of actually, we had the same problem in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Like for us to defeat the Taliban or the Sunni insurgency, we had to establish a security situation where the people felt secure enough to go with an alternative, right? Which means
Right.
real security. And all the Taliban or, the Sunni insurgency needs to do is just sneak out of go make something go boom and then go back and hide inside the population. And then the perception is they're winning. This is the kind of naval air equivalent of that. It's not a thing,
Yeah.
massive land war, but that's what they're doing. Um,
Interesting. Yeah. One of the things that makes me extra uh, concerned about what you're saying. So I think we've been talking about American interests, but it feels like Trump has his own interests here,
mm,
which are he needs the story to be Trump wins,
yep.
which means he can't have Iran saying, no, no, we win. And it seems like both sides, you talked about saving face.
Mm.
I wonder, in a normal situation, right, we can be in it, we can be adults and recognize everyone's going to declare victory and go home, however this ends. And I wonder if that's acceptable to either side in this case, which is pretty worrisome. Let me just close out since I know you, like I said, you have a lot of demands on your time. But let me just ask you. I'm going to ask you two questions, and they're the same, so you just choose how you want to answer it. Um, what's something that I haven't asked you yet that you're like, oh, I wish we had gotten to talk about this? Or another way of thinking about it is just, you've thought about this region of the world and our policy toward it for decades. What surprised you the most? What had you anticipated the least over the last couple of weeks?
Yeah. So I think what has been most surprising and also similarly what you has been this whole exchange on going after oil facilities as intensely as that has been and two things. And maybe the single most surprising thing is Iran has managed to basically close the Strait of Hormuz in terms of nobody else wants to put their ships through there. And so you're losing millions of barrels a day to the market because Iran has created this threat. At the same
Yeah.
time, they're pushing a million barrels of their own oil through it a day. That is not something I expected. The scenario always was Iran will mine the Strait of Hormuz in the most extreme outcome, and then nobody else will be able to ship oil, but they won't be able to ship oil either, which is why they won't do it or why they will only do it in the most extreme scenarios. The fact that they've managed to disrupt global oil markets as much as they have while still preserving a lot of their own revenue streams is the biggest surprise for me. And it's that's a very bad outcome for us
Why
because
yeah, why aren't we able to, blow that stuff up? Not to put too fine a
I
point on
mean,
it.
I think we could, but I think Trump is deterred from doing it because then oil prices will go from 110 to 130 and
Oh, I see.
he's looking at his own domestic politics. And so
Yeah,
he's a
so
twister to the market here.
yeah, well, I guess it's sort of similar to the situation Europe found itself in with Russia, right? We're sort of paying them while we fight them. So, that's fun. Okay, well, on that happy note, I'm gonna let you go, but I really appreciate you taking the time, and, this has been an eye-opening 30 minutes. Everyone, who's watching, definitely check out Word on the Street. And Lon, is there anything else? And just Alon's personal Substack. There's, a lot like you've been posting a lot of good, interesting notes and pieces and things like that. Anywhere else people can and should find you?
Check out J Street, our organization that I work with, which is really just trying to insert nuanced debate into these issues, whether primarily on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but also on Iran and all other issues having to do with the Middle East. That's what we spend our time doing.
Yeah.
So
So
something of interest and you want to see American politics change in that direction and want to have that kind of conversation, check us out.
yeah, I second that, and yeah, thanks again, and I'm sure we'll talk sometime soon.
All right. Take care.
Okay, talk to you later.
Bye.